is that Cubans and Cuban Americans still talk about those to this day, and more so because they were part of the continuation of violence that happened even after the revolution, and it definitely set the tone. There are some people that will say, well, that's just part of war, or that's just part of the retribution after an already bloody reign by Batista. I will ask you this. Is putting LGBTQ people, dissidents, and other non-conforming folks in a forced labor internment camp part of war? And I ask you that because El Che he had a very important role in starting the Guanahacabibes, and I hope I'm saying that right, camp, which was the first camp of this kind in Cuba for people who, according to El Che Guevara, people who have committed crimes against revolutionary morals. Now, what does that mean?
Well, if you want to refer back to our previous episodes, that could mean fucking anything.
If you're a social deviant or dissident, it includes homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, practitioners of Afro-Cuban religions, and even non-political rebels. This actually started a practice called UMAP, which are las unidades militares de ayuda a la producción, which was a series of camps that, according to a 1967 human rights report, over 300,000 internees were forced to work for free, sunrise to sunset, 7 days a week, spoiled food, unhealthy water, unclean plates, no showers, and inmates are given the same treatment as political prisoners. I think that this is one of the most condemning parts of the legacy of El Che. To have such strict black and white revolutionary morals such that people are able to be imprisoned and forced into labor. And Carmen, forced labor was a pretty big part of what Che Guevara stood for.
Che thought of labor as the currency of the individual. He thought of it as the only trade that should exist between sectors as opposed to money. This sounds like a terrible nightmare because it forces you to live to work. On that note, he was tapped to be the president of the National Bank, the Minister of Industries, and he was also in charge of agrarian reform. Being in charge of the National Bank, he kicked out the IMF, kicked out all of the foreign banks, and tried to do away with banknotes. Much of his belief was to separate labor from money, and so because of that, in 1964, he introduced 24 salary wages and a 15% bonus for overcompletion. And within this system, he meant to include material incentives, which sounds a lot to me like dangling a bike in front of somebody and then telling them that if they're a good worker, then they can have the opportunity to buy that bike. But that's episode 4 of season 1. Anyway, while being in charge of agrarian reform, one of the things that he did was establish a work culture which later led to La Escuela del Campo, the school of the country, which all Cubans and Cuban Americans know to be a program where school-aged children were sent to the countryside to do hard manual labor in the sun. Again, with poor food, poor conditions, oftentimes no running water, and no actual supervision to pick crops for the state. Basically sending children to go do forced labor, and everyone had to go, and if you were a good student, well, you had to go even longer.
Fun fact, my mom was a good student, so from age 11 to age 18, she stopped living with her parents and was taken to una escuela del campo where she was boarded all year and picked tobacco from like 6 a.m. to who knows when, and then went to school and was judged on how much tobacco she was able to pick. So, thank you so much, Che Guevara.
Because that's the best thing to do with smart kids, right?
Yeah.
Super. As Minister of Industries, Che's economic roadmap for Cuba involved highly centralizing, eliminating the concept of markets, and relying on moral incentives, completely disregarding workers' agency and economic participation. This is in stark contrast with Marxist-Leninist thought and very in line with Stalinism.
El Che had admiration for Stalinism and wanted to use Stalinist principles to restructure Cuba. And you can see that in his Stalinist gulags, in his militancy, and more. El Che admired the political model of the USSR, which is a very repressive, all-encompassing one-party state owning and controlling the economy. And this means without unions or particular civil liberties. It's so important to distinguish between the version of communism that ended up being enforced by the guerrilla leaders that took charge of Cuba. And it wasn't that close to Marxism. It was so close to Stalinism. El Che actually also directly admired Joseph Stalin as a figure. This dude wrote his Aunt Beatrice and would sign his name Stalin too, believing that he was like the next Stalin. He even visited the USSR and he put flowers in Stalin's tomb. And this was in 1960, which was after everyone knew about Stalin's crimes. So in the history of the love affair of Stalin and Che, in later years, like in 1965, he started to distance himself from the USSR, but it doesn't seem related to the atrocities committed. He believed the USSR had become too privatized, so basically for more economic reasons. And so all in all, his admiration of Joseph Stalin definitely helps to paint a picture of what this man's values were and what he tried to impose on other people.
And going back to this whole like militant guerrilla style approach to the revolution, it kind of starts to point to this new ism, this Guevaraism, which is more of a theory of the guerrilla elite, right? The people who are willing to, ride or die for the revolution and the causes that have been laid out. But the problem with that is that guerrilla warfare is a strategy. It's not a revolution. And so when it comes time to actually start to restructure after the so-called fight, you really don't have a lot to draw from. And this is a big reason why so many of his programs actually failed, I would say. And this is why it's difficult to think of him as a successful key architect of restructuring the Cuban state and economy, which we all know how that turned out. So I would go as far as saying that this idea of, and I'm doing air quotes, revolution being the most important thing, extending past the time of the actual revolution occurring, is a big part of the reason Cuba is the way it is now. And by that, I mean terrible.
Cubans raised in Cuba were taught to be like Che. And so part of revolutionary upbringing in Cuba is to actually truly admire Che as like this complete and kind of perfect human being and martyr of the revolution. In the middle of the Revolutionary Plaza, there's an image of El Che Guevara. And I'm aware that like my family grew up only knowing that side of El Che Guevara in Cuba. In Cuba, when you're un pionero, and so let's go back to episode 4 of season 1, where we talk about the various communist groups that you must belong to at stages of your life. And so the youngest stage is when you are just a kid and you are un pionero de la revolución, or a pioneer of the revolution.
Pioneros por el comunismo.
That is the motto. Pioneers of the revolution. Let's be like Che. And so El Che's legacy was used and is used in Cuban revolutionary politics to uphold militancy and or to uphold utter commitment to the revolution.
Pioneros por el comunismo, seremos como el Che. And these little kids don't actually know anything about what the revolution truly means. I mean, they're words that they get taught in school, but to embody this and have to profess their intention to be just like Che in their own lifetimes, I mean, that's a little ridiculous.
I think that if we bring it back to the concept of patria o muerte, which means homeland or death, this is the kind of decision that you have to make in times of war. To choose your homeland or die. And those stakes are incredibly high. Does the concept of homeland or death fit into restructuring and building a Cuba that's better for its people? I think that Che Guevara, in his guerrilla politics, was really good at overthrowing a dictator because he did that by violent means in a coup d'etat. But then he was also really, really good at admiring a dictator, aka Stalin, and trying to enforce policies and create structures that would pave the way for another dictatorship, Fidel Castro.
He went around internationally trying to organize, radicalize, and form guerrilla militia in the name of violent revolution. And so there's a lot of people in Bolivia who I'm sure have very strong opinions about him. People in the Congo, people in Argentina, people in Guatemala. In some places, he's revered and regarded as a saint. And people look up to him. People look up to him as somebody who fought for workers and indigenous struggles.
The fact that this man wore this beret and he's a radical figure inspired the Black Panthers. It inspired brown beret wearers like Chicano activists. There's also people who see him just standing for anti-imperialism and they wear the t-shirt with his face on it because they're just like, this system sucks. And if he stands for that, then you can also be behind him. He was killed by what we may call imperialist forces. He was fighting a US-backed force in Bolivia. Since that's exactly what he had been fighting against his whole life, this helped escalate him more so into martyrdom.
The thing about El Che is that he, quote unquote, lived and then he definitely died for and by his beliefs. And that in and of itself is already something that could make you an icon, dying for the things you believe in. So he was assassinated in 1967, and it wasn't until 1968 that this image started being mass-produced and appearing in the Paris student riots and all over Belfast, all over Berkeley, Vietnam, all over the world. You started seeing student protests with posters of Che Guevara popping up. So he never saw his image become so popular.
That is what happens after you die. What's left is what you would, a version of what you stood for and kind of nothing else.
The story of Che Guevara to me is a story of contradictions. One quote of his that's really, really popular is, "At the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love." This is something that people who wear him on a t-shirt would probably identify with. But then he also said that a revolutionary is a cold killing machine motivated by pure hate.
Look, if you want to admire and print a different face that still stands for like egalitarian politics and anti-imperialism and workers' politics, like, dude, go ahead, do it. Everyone should have like all sorts of different opinions about how to rule the world and all of that. But the thing is, this guy sucked. And so, like, I don't know.
This is just what we think. I live in Brooklyn. Half of Brooklyn probably owns a Che Guevara t-shirt. I don't hate any of them. I love you all. We just wanted to tell you some stuff. That's all. He has become this super popular image. Everybody knows who Che Guevara is at this point. There's movies made about him, his pictures on everything from little kid socks to t-shirts, and I don't really think that Ernesto Che Guevara would be this giant figure if it hadn't been for his image. I don't think he's that unique. I think everything that he contributed to history would have happened anyway. It just would have been by somebody else.
Claro que sí, Carmen. Como Dios pintó a Perico.
Yes.
And with that, we're moving on to our cubanismo. Como Dios pintó a Perico.
Like God painted the parakeet.
Or like God painted some guy named Perico. Who knows? It's a call and response when nothing else could have happened. Like when it's inevitable. Instead of saying, yeah, obviously, you can just say, como Dios pintó a Perico.
Yeah.
Like God painted a parakeet. Because I guess there was no other way that it could have happened.
Thank you so much to all of our patrons, Jesse, Kellis, Yvette, Josh, Daniel, Jason, Karina, Suli, Sarah, Kristen, Amauri, Kaylee, Lauren, Catherine, Salia, Susan, Jose, Ryan, Andy, Derek, D. We love you all so much. Thank you for being wonderful supporters and seeing us into our second season. You know where to find us on social media. It's at teikirisi.pod. And if you want to shoot us an email, it's teikirisi.pod@gmail.com. See you next time and take it easy.
Take it easy, folks.